This is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. In this episode, we're going to be diving into a topic that affects all of us, eventually, getting older. But we're not talking about wrinkles and retirement homes. Today, we're going to explore how Australia's ageing population will shape our future, and in particular, our housing markets. As we know, Australia's demographics is shifting, and one of the most significant trends is the rapid increase in our elderly population. This demographic change is set to have profound implications on everything from housing demand to workforce, and especially in the aged care sector. Simon, you've been studying and writing extensively about how population shifts are going to affect everything. So today I'd like to get your insights on how our growing elderly population is going to put a strain on aged care and the property markets. This is a factor that's going to affect all of us.
Oh, very much so. And there is no escaping aging from an individual perspective, but most importantly, from a demographic, from a national perspective, we are going to age and there is nothing we can do about it.
And Simon, I'm sorry to correct you at the beginning of the show, but there is something that could stop aging, but that alternative is not very good, is it?
That's right. Yeah, aging is always better than the alternative. And as a nation, if we grow older, that's of course first and foremost a sign of progress. It's a sign of us not dying early enough. It's a sign of a nation having a healthcare system that functions. It's a sign of a nation that is rich enough to maintain this healthcare system. So an aging society, it sounds a bit scary, maybe, but it really is a sign of progress, and it's something that any kind of rich and therefore bit by bit aging society does need to deal with in one way or another eventually.
Well, Simon, you write every week in the New Daily, which is not behind a paywall, so people can get your musings every week on the New Daily on a Saturday and once a month in the Australian, which is behind a paywall. But you mentioned that Australians are yet to understand how fast we're aging and what this means for our future. So tell us, what actually is happening?
Yeah, so if we look at the far end of the aging spectrum, so the 85 plus cohort, I think that's a good starting point here, because 85, statistically speaking, is such an important year. It's called the median age of death, which means that half of us, you get to decide whether it's me or Michael, does not make it.
I'm much closer than you.
But so, yeah, half of a nation, half of Australia will make it past 85. But the surviving 50%, half of them will need assistance with activities of daily life. They will need care. And so it is obviously expensive to grow old as a nation, but it is also labor intensive. And this is by now written in stone, just how much we age. We are going to double the 85 plus cohort in just 14 years. That is very, very fast. From just under 600,000 people to 1.2 million people. And that is definitely going to happen because we're not importing old people from overseas. The 85-year-olds of 2034, they are the 75-year-olds of today. So that is absolutely inevitable. And the way that things are going right now with our aged care system, we will definitely not have enough aged care workers in the system to look after our elderly population. There's no scenario where this can happen. So that means we need to completely, radically transform, reinvent how we deliver aged care in this country.
Well, I want to look at a number of aspects of ageing, Simon, and one of them that's clearly of interest to me is how our ageing population is going to change demand for housing. What do you see happening in the various housing markets?
Well, first and foremost, we want to remember that it is now the time bit by bit for the big baby boomer cohort to enter this old age stage of the life cycle. And yes, people downsize. Downsizing is a real phenomenon. It does happen, but it does not happen at the scale that we sometimes make it out to be. Yes, people in Australia, they move from the big capital cities to Noosa, to the Sunshine Coast to retire, absolutely. But more than anything, Australians are stubborn bastards, and they say stuff like, I want to be carried out of my family home. which could be considered downsizing into the box. But more than anything,
Yes.
more than anything, Australians do not downsize. So we know where they are. But that means that you then only tend to downsize at scale when you're forced to do so. So in the old age living world, we talk about there's a difference between aged care homes. This is where you go in because you are really frail and somebody needs to look after you in a very permanent sense. And so you then move into this aged care home. But there's this previous housing model beforehand, which is called the retirement village or retirement living facility. And the difference between those two categories, roughly speaking, is that you choose to move into a retirement living village and somebody else chooses for you to go into an aged care home. So that is essentially the difference there. And demand for these both property types is obviously going absolutely through the roof. So these are the two fastest growing segments in the property market in the next 10, 20 years. No discussion about it. So plenty of opportunities there, if you will. And there are also opportunities to solve quite a few issues that we have in terms of mental health. When we look at mental health, we know that just after retirement, you have absolutely excellent mental health. You have the best mental health of your whole life because you finally, got rid of your job. You still have enough money. You still have good health to enjoy life a bit. Maybe you have grandkids to engage with. This is a wonderful phase of the life cycle. But bit by bit, your health declines. Eventually, your friends, your partners start dying at scale. And then loneliness becomes a severe issue for our elderly people. And particularly, this loneliness in old age gets worse the more car dependent your suburb is. So I always urge and encourage people in their mid 70s to say, well, it might be time to downsize. You're both still alive, move to a walkable neighborhood. It doesn't need to be a retirement village or anything, but just make sure that you are in a neighborhood where you have medical facilities in walkable distance, where you are easy to reach for your friends and family to visit. And that makes all the world of a difference for your mental health. That's the single best thing you can do for your mental health in old age, is to actually downsize at the right time.
Well, that's an interesting thought, because what about people who live in regional Australia, in rural locations too? That would be much harder for them, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And we see this at a whole population level, what's happening to small towns. So quite often small towns are agricultural towns where the aging workforce, if the old farmer finally has to give in and can't operate the farm anymore, what does he do? Well, he can't hand it down to his kids because they became teachers and nurses. And so that leads to farm aggregations. So that minimizes the pool of local workers that are needed to man those farms, because those bigger corporate farms, they get the same or better yields out of the ground with fewer workers. And so the town shrinks. That means medical services slowly are not viable in this town anymore. So that means the population that wanted to age in place, they can't. So they need to move to the next biggest regional hub. We call this the sponge city effect, where the regional hub, like a Horsham in Australia, in Victoria, where they would soak up the aging population of the smaller rural settlements surrounding it. And that really, bit by bit, sucks the lifeblood out of those tiny towns, whereas a Horsham might be tricked into thinking it's doing well because it's growing its population base, but it is also massively speeding up its aging.
That's a real shame, because some of those small country towns have got real character as you drive through them, but I can see why that would work. So there's going to be a couple of economic effects in the regional and rural areas. What economic impact do you anticipate that ageing population is going to have in other parts of our nation?
Well, wherever you look, it means you take out a big chunk of the cohort out of the workforce. That's what starts with retirement. So we now, for the next, in 6 years' time, even the youngest baby boomer will be of retirement age. So we take this big cohort out. That is severe. So we lose workers. And so then we have to find workers elsewhere, and we don't have enough young people. Those young people, we do not produce enough of them. So we have a shortage of young people in the workforce. This leads to a skills shortage overall. For the next 10 years, we make it worse by millennials continuing to make babies. That means they go on parental leave. So the sheer aging of society always draws down the labor pool. And all the while you create more people that still consume services, particularly medical services at scale. And that then has a negative impact on the productivity. We call this the dependency ratio, meaning how many non-workers, old people and young people, kids are dependent on the workforce. So that's a challenge. But the particular challenges that are obviously happening everywhere is if you have areas with more and more old people, these older people need service workers, aged care workers, for example, to look after them. And the aged care sector in particular already has a shortage of aged care workers. That's a problem to begin with. We're now going to double this workforce, or we want to double this workforce in the next 14 years. That's difficult. Aged care workers have very poor retention rates. So many workers leave the industry as soon as they can to go into a higher paid industry because there are enough employment opportunities elsewhere. So it's going to be very, very hard to have enough workers to look after our old people. And so I think we cannot possibly fool ourselves into thinking that the status quo, the current model of delivering aged care, will be successful in even as soon as 5-6 years, let alone 14 years when we will have doubled the 85 plus cohort.
So is artificial intelligence the answer? I don't think that's going to change the beds or move the food around, is it?
No, it's not. Absolutely not. But when we talk about AI, when we talk about robotics in aged care, we're not talking about robots flipping over old people or something like this. That's not what we talk about. We talk about quite potentially revolutionary systems, though. If you think about an aged care worker as they are operating today, they're most likely born overseas. They're most likely not an English native speaker. They quite likely have poor English language skills. So it's utterly plausible that there is a software package that allows the individual aged care worker to do all the boring compliance paperwork stuff, the reporting part of the job. They speak into an app in their mother tongue. The app translates the language into English and fills out the right boxes in the relevant forms. You would therefore free up quite a bit of time out of this person's working life to be spent not on paperwork and compliance, but on care work. That's the type of transformation that I talk about here. But we can even talk about robots, even in a hospital setting or something like this. We're not talking about robots doing the actual care work. Nothing makes me more angry than going through a hospital and seeing nurses, highly skilled nurses, carrying medicines from A to B. That's a waste of their time. You've all been to restaurants here where you have the little robot, delivering the tray to you. This could be done in a hospital. Sure, put a lock on it so I don't nick your pills when I visit a hospital. But more than anything, that's what we need. We need to completely dismantle workflows in organizations to make sure that we squeeze in technology, robotics, AI, all those fun words, just in case where you can. And so you need to make the workforce more efficient that way. That said, technological solutions to aged care also need to tackle the beginning, where we avoid that people need aged care to begin with. So how can you ensure that you live independently for longer? Of course, the built environment can change. You will see massive amounts of home modifications where houses get altered, bathrooms door widened, the steps get removed, lifts get introduced into the bigger houses. These things will happen at scale, guaranteed. And they will help. Even simple stuff like putting a Apple Watch around the wrist of an elderly person might help, because that could allow to detect a fall. And in the long run, we'll have much more vital signs being monitored through wearable devices. And this would then alert people in front before they have particular medical instances. Would say, statistically speaking, you're much more likely to have a heart attack. These kind of things. It sounds silly, maybe a bit futuristic, but that type of stuff will help you to live independently for a bit longer. And it doesn't sound much when we say, hey, mom and dad can live independently longer for another half a year. But multiply this times 1.2 million people over 85. And all of a sudden you need you gained efficiencies. You need fewer workers to service this population. And that's where the wins are hiding in the system.
Now, you talked about aged care workers, but also what about all the healthcare system? We know currently the hospitals are creaking. They can't handle all the healthcare needs of our nation at present. We know that NDIS is having trouble. We know that the pension system, is there enough money to pay the pensions? So I can see the government's going to have to be spending a lot more money. But you've already mentioned that the baby boomers are leaving the workforce. In my mind, Simon, this just means there's no question that we're going to have to keep migration up, importing more people. We need more taxpayers, people at tax-paying age. Either that or those who are already working are going to have to get taxed more. And I don't think that's going to be very politically popular, is it?
Absolutely. So we will continue to be a migration nation. I'm very, very optimistic about this. I'm very sure about this because migration solves more problems than it creates. The running out of the workforce, out of workers, that is severe. You can mitigate this by migrating people in. That's easy enough. International students are crazy cash cows, economically speaking, because they create so much economic wealth. And whenever you hear a politician talk about cutting down migration, they do this under the umbrella of wanting to make housing more affordable. But this is always such a convenient narrative because it says, hey, we make housing more affordable by blaming it all on the non-voting cohort of migrants. Also, this means we tick the box of having talked about affordable housing, and we therefore, as politicians, do not need to talk about those issues where we were complicit in making housing more expensive. We're talking about things like first homebuyer grants. That stuff drives house prices up. Everyone knows it's not a single economist would argue against it. And stuff like stamp duty. Get rid of stamp duty, introduce a land tax, housing will be more affordable. Political suicide, because 2/3 of the Australian population own the home they're in, and they will vote for the party that does not tax them on their land. So it's very hard politically to do this. And instead of doing the hard yards or being honest about, hey, we can't make it cheaper, catch you later, we'll have them masquerading as doing something about affordable housing. First homebuyer grants were just that. That is just cosplaying, making housing cheaper. It's silly. And we now talk tough about migration. Whatever party will be in power, they will continue a high migration approach. It is absolutely guaranteed. It creates much, much fewer problems than it solves problems.
Now, we talked about certain industries doing well, the renovation industry, the aged care, the healthcare system, but I know a lot of people listening to this podcast and watching this on YouTube are in business. So actually, before I ask you the question for business people, hey, if you're watching this for the first time and you don't currently subscribe, or if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast player, just stop for a sec. I've got a whole lot more I want to ask Simon, but just subscribe to this so that once a week you get the great information that Simon is going to be sharing with you. And then occasionally we're going to have some special guests as well. So do that. And then when you come back, my question to you, Simon, is what other industries, this is more for the business people, who else is going to benefit from the change in our demographics?
Well, the aging of society in the short term, let's call it the next 10 years, will massively boost tourism. We have an absolute dream of a consumer cohort for the next 10 plus years. That's the baby boomers. They are leaving the world of work. They are asset rich. They own their own homes. They are cash rich. They own the vast majority of cash savings in this country. That is wonderful. They now have time. They even still have their health. Yes, all the joints hurt and creak a bit, but they're still mobile, active. They're out and about. And because of the pandemic lockdowns, they even feel a sense of urgency to part with their money. This is the absolute dream of a consumer for the next decade or so. And so plenty of businesses, tourism, little luxury consumption and so forth, they will have a marvelous time with the boomers.
Well, baby boomers, as you say, did feel that they've missed out. We missed a couple of cruises, Pam and I, so we're taking 3 holidays in the second half of this year to make up for that. I fully know where you're coming from, and there's also the YOLO, you only live once mentality that a lot of baby boomers are getting, but they're also passing some of the money down to their children, as we explained in last week's podcast about the great wealth transfer. If you haven't listened to that, wherever you're listening to this podcast, go back to the podcast app, and Simon shared about the great wealth transfer that I think we all need to understand as investors, as business people, as managers in organizations. So certain things are, I guess, predetermined with demographics. That's why I love talking with you about it, because while there's so many uncertainties ahead, there are clearly some things that are just almost set in stone, aren't they?
I think that demographics well and truly are the closest thing we do have to a crystal ball, particularly in migration nations, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US. These are nations that have pretty close control over their own borders, and they dictate the immigration intake. So forecasting the population only 10 years into the future is very easy and pretty precise. This is more complicated in a European country where you have more open borders. It's more complicated in a country with a lot of political unrest, where there is the risk of what we call population displacements. All of these things would be more difficult. We can forecast the future pretty precisely, and therefore it's a self-serving narrative. But I think it's very important that you have your finger on the pulse of demographics to understand what's coming ahead, because it is more predictable than you might think.
Well, every now and then the government produces the Intergenerational Report, and I want to discuss that with you on a separate podcast. So the government or the statisticians are looking at what's ahead. But do you think government policies are actually taking this into account? Do we have policies for this aged care system that you keep saying isn't going to cope, or just for our aging population in general, Simon?
Now I'm a bit scared here that we're not doing enough. That this is something that is so obvious that it's coming, and we're not making policy forecasts. So what could we do in order to help our old populations? I think we would massively help the mental health if we encourage right sizing, downsizing, because it might sound wonderful to live independently in your own house as a widow, but we know from mental health data that statistically speaking, that's not true. So encouraging and incentivizing people. This is, of course, a free country, and you can completely disregard all of those incentives. But incentivizing people to downsize, to move while both partners are alive into a walkable community, making new friends, establishing a new social network. And that doesn't need to be with people of your own age group. This can be younger, older people as well. But that's important. We know that your mental health improves like crazy if this is the case. Just the data is what this tells me. And of course, we want to encourage that people spend their money. So that's the idea of we are currently in a system where old people play the game of with how much wealth can I die, rather than handing down the wealth to the next generation while they're still alive, rather than spending their money. There's no need to die with a lot of money. It's the only problem with this issue is, of course, that you don't know when you're going to die. And so you're always at the fear of, doesn't matter how much money you accrued, how much wealth you accrued, you still feel I might live forever. And I don't want to run out of money in my, in my latest years. So it's hard to time this. And of course, it requires the awkward task of thinking about your own mortality, which is something that we avoid very, very much.
Simon, finally, What can younger generations do to prepare for their own ageing? And how can society as a whole, I guess, better support our ageing population when you consider that about a third of our elderly are going to, a population is going to be elderly as we move forward?
One fantastic thing we've already done in Australia, this was to introduce superannuation. Superannuation is an absolutely marvelous tool in an aging society because it means that everyone, we put a gun to your head, we say, hey, 10, 12% of your money that goes into this bucket. And as of, I think, 2032, we'll have the first person retire that paid into their superannuation account for the full life cycle. And then it takes another couple of decades until somebody retires that paid into the super account at the full fee for the whole life cycle. That's marvelous. That's what superannuation is for. You pay for your own retirement, not the pension system. A pension system is very much difficult in an aging society. And it is also it has the potential to create political unrest. If I think of my home country of Germany, there's one big bucket. Everyone is supposed to put a bit of money of their wage into this bucket, and there's a formula that says you put that much money in, you get that much money out. But that's not set in stone. As the country ages like crazy, sooner or later, a treasurer that can use a calculator will eventuate, and they would say, oh no, we're running out of money in the bucket. We need to freeze pension payouts. We cannot increase them. And that opens up the doors for political charlatans who say the opposite, who say, no, we give you full pensions. And then you run a pension scheme into the ground. And then you really run out of money. Or it opens up the doors for political extremists. That the smart parties in power, they still very much hold the course of the responsible policies, but the extremists can grab votes by just essentially capturing the disappointed elderly poor. We do not have that structure issue in Australia because of superannuation. That's an often misunderstood or misappreciated aspect of our superannuation system. So good on us in Australia for actually having done the marvelous thing in the 90s or 80s. This was thought up to know that the baby boomer cohort will eventually retire. And that always keeps me hopeful for a country that we can look into the future. And I'm not getting tired of encouraging people to take the longitudinal view of the world and to make sure that every policy that is set in place is essentially being argued. How does this change the world in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 50 years? I want people to think in those long terms because that ultimately makes for better policy and better social outcomes.
I think another factor is people should have their own home in retirement. It would be terrible to end up in your golden years or your silver years, as I am, and have to pay rent. And we know that unfortunately there is a percentage of retirees who have to pay rent. And when you look at what the pension gives them, there really isn't much left over. Matchy noodles in retirement doesn't taste very good.
No, and absolutely. That's absolutely the most important thing you can do financially speaking. We know that once you have your own house or home, flat, doesn't matter, in retirement, you minimize the housing costs, which is by far your biggest cost. And your incomes are going to shrink in retirement anyways. So that is absolutely crucial. That would also be my word of advice, legal asterisks, not a financial advice, to young people that if you cannot afford a house, have a plan of how you can afford an retirement investment property. Can you do this? Can you rent vest? Can you make sure that you actually, in some way or form, buy an apartment to not have rental costs in old age? And we talked about this with the last episode about the intergenerational wealth transfer. You might be not able to afford a house while you have kids, but when the kids are out of the house, right around then your parents die. And that additional wealth that you then gain, throw that into your retirement property. Make sure that you utilize this. Make sure that you do not go into retirement without a humble, small property. Doesn't need to be a flash, sexy villa or anything. A humble, modest house is all it takes to make sure that you are financially safe and secure in retirement.
I guess that's the concept of delayed gratification. Do the hard things now so you have an easier life later. Otherwise, do the easy things now and spend that inheritance, and you're going to have a harder life later. Now, Simon, we spent a bit of time talking about immigration as well. In our show next week, I'd like to ask you the question, what if we stop immigration? What would happen to Australia? Because they're talking about lowering immigration levels. Of course, being an election year, there's going to be a lot more talk about that. So how realistic is it and what would it mean? So I look forward to catching up with you again next week. But if you, as our listeners and our viewers, enjoyed hearing Simon and understanding what's ahead for our future, for your future, please just stop for a second. I keep mentioning this because this is a new show, but boy, are the numbers and downloads building up very, very quickly. So I'd like you to be one who gets our show every week as well. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. And Simon, I look forward to talking with you about immigration next week.
Very much looking forward to it as well. I'll see you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform you.